Welcome to the Classical Gabfest, a weekly discussion about the ever-changing world of classical music. I'm your host for this week, Tiffany Liu, and with me as always are Kensho Watanabe and William White. This week, we'll be discussing the first opera released as an NFT. Then we'll review the new album Amazone by the Jupiter Ensemble. And finally, we'll talk about TWOSET Violin's video, Can Classical and Pop Musicians See Eye to Eye? But first, we'd like to start with our prelude segment. So, Kensho, what do we have today?
This week, we'll be playing a round of everyone's favorite game, Stolen Strings. We all know the quote, good artists borrow, great artists steal. Well, today I'm challenging our contestants and you, our listeners, to engage in a bit of oral detective work and track some heists back to their original sources. I've compiled 3 examples of great non-classical references to classical themes or motifs, and it's my co-host's goal to identify the stolen material. All of these heists have been explicitly acknowledged by the artist thieves, but some of the musical references are actually quite difficult to hear. All right, here is song number 1.
Life alone, with no one left to love.
Aww, that's sweet.
That is, if I'm not mistaken, a reference to the Nimrod variation from the Variations on an Original Theme by Sir Edward Elgar.
Wow, how very completionist of you there, Will.
Also known as the Enigma Variations.
Correct. And this is a song called The Globalist by Muse, who I think has appeared before on this game.
Muse has appeared before. Yeah, they're like sort of a classically, they have a lot of that stuff. I remember when I used to be a music theory instructor at Indiana University, and I would ask the kiddos, the undergraduates, what they were into. Muse was a very popular answer. So this would have been around like 2010, and I have never heard anything more from them since then. So I don't know what they're up to these days.
Alrighty, so that was song number 1, easily identified. Here is song number 2.
I make fakes deteriorate like Richard Pryor. Who's the liar? Who's the man with the answers? A mighty exhibitor, break them down like cancer. Trying to survive in this high price of living. That's why most is dead or in prison in a whole new style of living.
I'm lost.
I have zero idea. I don't know. There was some little beeping scales in the back, like bum 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 bum.
Yeah.
Oh, could that bum 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 bum? Could it be that? Is it Hall of the Mountain King?
It is not, so
Okay.
I'm going to take that as your first guess.
Yeah.
You are on the right track
In terms of listening to
in
that
terms
scale.
of what you're listening for.
Uh-huh.
What comes directly after this kind of gives it away. That's why I'm stopping it at this moment. So I'm going to play it one more time and see if you can identify it with paying attention to that little beeping thing that you said and see if we can get there.
Yeah.
Here we go.
Somebody exhibitor, break them down like cancer. Trying to survive in this high price of living. That's why most is dead or in prison in a whole new style of living.
Yeah. Da dee 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 dee. What is that? Da dee 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 dee.
A lot of things, frankly.
No, but it's
But-
something. It's something.
Okay. I'm lost. I don't have anything.
Kensho, I'm onto it, right?
Yeah, you're close. You're there. You're on the cusp.
Is it opera? It sounds like something that might
Yes,
be
yes,
opera.
yes, yes, yes. It's da-dun, dee-dee. Is it from no, it's from Tosca, right? Isn't it Luciani le Stelle?
Yes.
so the song is it's by Exhibit, and it's a collaboration with this producer called The Rhapsody without the H, with the H missing.
Course.
And the title of this is A Lucean le Stelle because they just had a typo, I think.
Lol.
They just forgot the V in the actual name of that song.
Amazing.
Or maybe it's intentional, but I thought this was really funny. So great, good
Nice.
sleuthing.
That
there,
was a
Will.
nice one. Nice one.
So the next one is gonna be very probably easy to identify.
Good.
I'm doing this as kind of a shout out to. Do you guys know the Instagram account called Opera Beats?
No.
Mm-mm.
Okay, so it's this great Instagram account that takes those like concert clips on YouTube and remixes them with like rap tracks
Yeah.
and hip hop tracks, and they do it on a loop, and it's actually done really, really well. So I encourage all our listeners to go check out Opera Beats on Instagram. And so it's kind of a tribute to this because this would be something that Opera Beats would totally do with the performance of this work. So here we go. This is song number 3.
Yeah, you funny style to me. And the beat drop, just a numb could go and see pop. You the type that'll run when the heat pop. The type that'll how to go when you see cop. But not me, I'll aim a 38 at the ground. Show up the next day if they wait for the
And so it goes.
Nice. That's actually one of my favorite symphonic transitions. So that's the transition from the third to the fourth movement of Schumann 4.
Schumann's Fourth Symphony, D minor, right?
Right.
This is actually into the first
Into the first movement.
Into the first
Introduction
movement. Oh, yeah,
into
right. From the
Allegro.
introduction
Yeah.
into the first movement. Right. Good stuff.
Yeah, this was fun. They're more in the rap sphere that we can probably find in the future.
Yeah, we haven't really done the. I mean, rap. It seems like it would lend itself to slightly easier identifications because they use the samples.
Yeah, they build the hook off of it, so it can be very easily identified. But I found ones that were a little.
But
bit
I think that's
less.
really good. I encourage that for this game.
Good stuff.
Yeah, this is a fun one. That just about does it for this week's Prelude segment, but before we wrap up, we'd like to remind our listeners that we do periodic listener-generated named at tune rounds, so we invite you to try and stump us. Check our show notes where you'll find a link to the forum where you can upload a 30-second clip of an unidentified piece of classical music for us to try to identify. And with that, we move on to our first topic. Will, what do you have for us?
If you've been paying attention to the world of fine art over the last couple years, you're probably aware of the advent of the NFT, that is the non-fungible token, a new blockchain technology that enables art lovers to own art digitally in a way never available before. Now NFTs have entered the world of classical music. The Dallas Symphony has released one of their concerts as an NFT with a starting bid of $50,000. And now the first ever NFT opera has been released. A production of Mason Bates' opera, The Revolution of Steve Jobs, is coming out as an NFT. And a sign that the NFT has really reached a point of cultural saturation, my own mother sent me an article last month and told me that I needed to look into getting my music out there as an NFT because it is, quote, the future. I'll admit that in spite of the fact that I've read several articles on the subject, and I am also a regular listener to the Slate Money podcast, I still have only the foggiest idea how this whole thing works. So luckily we are joined today by someone who can explain it to us. Tim Schneider is the business editor at ArtNet News, the art industry's most read online trade publication, where he also co-produces the Art Angle podcast. He's the founder of the Gray Market blog, author of the book The Great Reframing, How Technology Will and Won't Change the Gallery System Forever, and perhaps his most impressive accomplishment, for a year he was my roommate at the University of Chicago. Tim, welcome to the podcast.
Will, thanks for having me on.
All right, Tim, start at the most basic level. Explain it to me like I'm a 5-year-old. What is an NFT?
Okay, so I'm going to give you a short answer, and then I can give you a longer answer that I think is more helpful. So an NFT is essentially a unique alphanumeric code, meaning it's just a one-of-a-kind string of letters and numbers that acts as proof of ownership for a specific digital file or physical object. And what separates NFTs from digital certificates of authenticity that you could have bought and sold a generation ago is that they are tracked on that magical thing you referred to called the blockchain, which is a related technology that demands its own unpacking. The whole crypto world is kind of a Russian nesting doll of jargon.
Okay, that's a good start for us, but you said that there's a more helpful, longer answer. So flesh that out for us.
So in order to get into this, we have to dissect the phrase non-fungible token, because neither one of these words really means much of anything to somebody speaking conversational English in 2021. So we'll start with the non-fungible part. Non-fungible, as I'm sure you gathered, is just the opposite of fungible, which begs the question, well, what does fungible mean? Fungible just means something is interchangeable or it has the same value as whatever it is that you're comparing it to. So the classic example is that if I have a $20 bill and you have a $20 bill, Will, and we were to trade $20 bills, it would make no difference to how much buying power either one of us has at the end of that exchange, because $20 bills are fungible. Non-fungible assets don't work like that. And the example I always use to try to bring this down to earth is dogs. If I own a dog and you, Will, own a dog, which I don't think that you do.
No, I don't believe in ownership of animals, so go ahead.
So I don't own a dog either. It doesn't matter. Hypothetically, let's say that we both do. But if that were the case, then broadly speaking, we would own broadly similar assets, so to speak. But even if the two dogs are the same breed, or let's say that they even came from the same litter, those details don't matter, because every dog owner has a unique emotional connection to their dog that makes them value that dog differently than every other dog on the planet. So if you had two dog owners come up to one another and say, hey, let's trade dogs, and then they each came home, and let's say they have families, and they said, hey, so this isn't Fido, the dog that you've grown up with your entire life. This is Rex, but it doesn't matter because he's the same breed, and who really cares? That person's relationship with their children may never recover from that transaction. That's because dogs are a non-fungible asset.
All right. Okay. This is very good. I think I understand what fungibility and non-fungibility are. Now, what about token?
Okay. So token it doesn't have anything to do with currency, which tends to be confusing because most people's introduction to anything crypto is cryptocurrency. But in this case, a token is just a unique alphanumeric code, one of a kind string of letters and numbers that acts as proof of ownership for a digital file or a physical object. And the thing about the token is that it has a whole bunch of metadata attached to it, meaning information about when something was made, who made it, and in a case where the NFT that you have is an NFT of a digital file, usually there will be a link to the file that it actually is supposed to verify ownership to. And this also brings about, I think, the most commonly misunderstood element of NFTs, which is that in almost all cases, the NFT is not the actual artwork. It's just something that verifies ownership of something else. So then if you put all of that together, the non-fungible aspect, the token aspect, we come back to that kind of original definition of an NFT as a unique alphanumeric code that acts as a digital certificate of ownership for a particular asset that has a unique value. And since that asset, whether it's digital or whether it's physical, has a unique value, the certificate of ownership that's attached to it does too. Therefore, the NFT has value because the thing that it connects to has value.
Okay, now we've got the ball rolling here. I want to get into how this connects to the world of classical music, and I actually want to throw it over to Kensho here, because Kensho, I know that you have participated in a couple of talks or seminars or something online about NFTs in the world of classical music, and you were really pushing to bring this to the podcast. So what do you know about NFTs and how they relate to classical music?
Well, hilariously, just as little as you do, Will, I think. No, I think I participated in some kind of webinar recently hosted by Audrey Bergauer, who we've mentioned before on the podcast. And they were talking specifically around the Dallas Symphony. They had Kim Ptolemy, is that her name? The CEO of the Dallas Symphony there to kind of explain what they were doing with the NFTs associated with that performance that the Dallas Symphony did with the Met Orchestra. The funny thing, the irony in that was that they had mentioned that they were trying to sell the NFT, but they hadn't sold it yet. So it was a little bit like, yeah, it's on the market, but we haven't sold it. So, but it's really successful. It's going really well. So that was the kind of messaging that we were getting from that. Where I get confused is the question of IP in terms of, so you said that you don't necessarily own the actual art, but let's put it in the context of what the intro was discussing, which is Mason Pate's opera, The Revolution of Steve Jobs, and it's going to be sold as an NFT. In terms of who owns the copyright of that, Mason, I'm assuming, still retains the copyright, but the person that ends up buying this NFT, the opera, is basically saying that they have some, either whether it's a PDF or an audio file of the opera, they have just this very unique, or just this unique alphanumeric code that says that they're the sole owner of that file that represents the opera. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, I think that's the right interpretation. And I should say here that the idea that you're a little confused about the IP is absolutely correct. You should be a little confused about the IP. It's actually, it's a murky area that has a lot of questions surrounding it in basically any variation of NFTs. And if they're selling an NFT of an opera, like they can't sell ownership of a live performance. That just doesn't even make any sense. So they have to be selling the NFT connected to a specific recording. And then on paper, or in theory, the value of that is that, of course, there are other recordings of that opera that are available elsewhere. And the NFT is a way of verifying that the person who owns the NFT owns effectively the licensed, artist-approved original version. And this gets into why NFTs are valuable, especially in the art market, because you have all these media that for a very long time have been very difficult to sell because they're primarily digital, and that means that they're infinitely replicable. If you are trying to sell let's say you have a short video that exists as a digital file, and you say, okay, I am selling this original video for $25,000. There are any number of ways that video could proliferate. It's probably available on your Vimeo page if you're the artist, or a YouTube page, or whatever else. There may be pirated editions of it out there. And the NFT is supposed to be a way for the artist to be able to say, okay, yes, there are these derivative versions out there that exist, but you, owner of the NFT, have the actual original of this thing. And therefore, it's worth paying a premium to have it, because then you actually can prove definitively that you're the one who possesses the unique, shining, original version of this thing, no matter what else is out there. For instance, there are all kinds of examples of visual artists who haven't even necessarily offered their own works as NFTs, and yet somehow they'll become aware that on OpenSea or Rarible or whatever platform that's out there, there's somebody else who has just like taken a screenshot of one of their JPEGs and is offering it as an NFT. Now, that seems like it shouldn't happen. Like, the entire premise of NFTs is supposed to be that can't actually take place. And yet we're seeing it happen all the time.
I'm so glad that you're saying it, because I mean, my overall question, if we just want to get to like brass tacks here, isn't this total bullshit? I mean, or at the very least, like, I don't know, like everybody that I follow on Twitter just thinks that this is like the douchiest thing, pardon my French, and it's just meant to like separate people with way too much money from some of that money who don't know any better. Tim, I mean, like, you're like the art world financial expert here, and I know that you were you used to manage several people's private art collections. Like, if you were managing somebody's private art collection, would you tell them to get into NFTs?
Well, here's what I would say. someone I know well in the art world who is on the dealer side called me back in the spring of this year. And they basically asked me that exact question. They were like, look, I have an artist who's very interested in doing this. They have enough of a profile that they should be able to sell anything they make for a pretty good price. The problem that I have as a dealer is I think that this whole thing is garbage. And basically, am I wrong? What should I do? And my advice to them at that point was, you should absolutely do this, but you should do it now. Like, you just have to move on this immediately, because I'm a pretty staunch skeptic of the technology. I think that there are some really well-meaning and very smart people who are trying to make this work in a way that actually benefits everybody. But I think that the majority of the people who are involved, especially as the profile of NFTs has grown and grown and grown to the point where you have people like Paris Hilton and Edward Snowden offering NFTs of whatever it is that they're doing, a lot of it is just a cash grab. And there is a sort of greater fool theory that applies to the market where, yeah, it's really lucrative as long as you're not the last one left holding the bag if and when this thing collapses. Now, I think that this is over the course of this year, I think that there's now like enough capital and enough infrastructure and enough smart people invested in this thing that it will probably sustain in some way, shape, or form. But as with everything else, like, it's just a gold rush right now. And there's going to be a point where even if it exists and sustains for the long term, a lot of what's generating revenue right now is going to collapse. Like, a small subset of winners will inevitably emerge. But by and large, yeah, I think that a lot of what's selling for even very high prices right now probably won't be around for the long run.
I mean, I am approaching this as somebody who like only has the foggiest understanding of what cryptocurrency by itself is, let alone, trying to attach value to things that are not like currency. And so my main question, I guess, learning about this is who would want to own an NFT to Mason Bates's opera and why? Because even if you look at it from the angle of the art, art market in general, like where people collect authentic pieces of let's say paintings, like actual concrete art, and that the vast majority of us don't understand why somebody would pay, millions of dollars for a painting that we might be able to see a replica or frankly even a photo of, and it makes not as much difference to most of us, I would say, if we go to see that on the internet or in a museum. What is the value of having something like that is digital? Because on some level, I kind of get why you would attach millions of dollars of value to owning like real pieces of fine art that you could display in some way. But like, what is the method by which you display Mason Bates's opera? And I guess you did explain this, Tim, earlier, but I'm still just like trying to think, like, where does the value of owning an NFT, even in a very abstract sense, come from?
No, it's a great question. I think that ultimately the best answer is that it confers bragging rights, and that's not fundamentally different from the main draw of collecting any art form at any other prior point in history either, whether it's a Picasso painting or a first edition of Moby Dick or something like that. This is just something that human beings have felt compelled to do for, I guess, as long as capitalism has existed. This is the one thing that I'll add, is that what we're seeing more and more is the idea that along with the NFTs, whoever the sellers or the artists are, they've started more and more offering these ancillary benefits or objects or whatever as a part of the package, so to speak.
There's perks.
Yeah. So, for instance, the platform where the Mason Bates opera is being sold, their first offering was a set of NFTs with this visual artist named Francesco Clemente. And along with the actual NFT, you were getting a live portrait painting session with the artist. Now that's kind of cool, and people who really love Francesco Clemente would definitely be into that, but it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with what the NFT itself
Not
is.
at all.
So I think that there is this acknowledgement that when you just offer the token as the token, there are a lot of people who have questions about whether or not it's something that's genuinely worth owning. And I should also add that from what we're seeing in the art market, and I think it's pretty true across the board, the people who are buying NFTs are not traditional collectors. Christie sold an NFT of a digital collage by Beeple for $69.3 million earlier this spring. And at the end of the auction, Christie's came out and, as a part of the press release, mentioned that 91% of the people who bid on the Beeple NFT were new to Christie's, meaning they had never had any prior dealings with them. And that's indicative, I think, of the type of audience that you're getting coming in. So in the Mason Bates case, I don't know. Maybe there are a few sort of classically minded traditional collectors in the musical field who will be interested in this, but it's almost just as likely that you'll have people who are just crypto whales saying like, well, what NFT that might be valuable could I get my hands on this week? Oh, this looks interesting. Why don't I go for this opera?
I was thinking about, as you were saying that, Tim, on the kind of the demographics level, just because I think that classical music, obviously, I don't think attracts the same kind of people that invest in crypto so much. Let's just say that on a general scale. So, some of the messaging that I was receiving from the webinar that I was at was kind of like, hey, this is a great way to attract new audiences, because the more classical music is on the NFT market, they would be attracting people that wouldn't otherwise be exposed to it. This is more of a question for all of us. Do you guys see that as an actual potential hook for people to be entering the classical music space through NFTs?
Well, I would have until I heard what Tim just said, because if what's happening is that these crypto whales, which is a term I love, by the way, get in on this and say, well, these are the first up, and like, why don't we just jump in and like snap them all up? And like, who knows if they're even going to care about or listen to it. That is a pretty strong argument against what I would perceive to be one of the arguments in favor of, NFTing works of art, which is that, it exposes more people, or it kind of allows, because there really has never quite been a way to own a performance. I mean, that is something that I feel like this introduces, a dynamic this introduces, and which could be potentially beneficial in the sense that it might, get a certain kind of person to donate, or, I mean, there are benefits that might accrue to our field. And so my question was going to be, does this actually benefit our field? But now what you've just said, Tim, worries me a little bit, because if that's the dynamic it sets up, then it's like, doesn't that just put it back in the douchey category, as Will said?
In the visual art field, the people who, by and large, have really been at the forefront of working with digital media, all the kinds of things that are not a classical painting, drawing, sculpture, or limited edition print thing. A lot of the artists and curators and thinkers in that space have gotten so involved in it precisely because of the fact that the traditional art market hasn't really known what to do with that field. And so it's been this area where it's not anywhere near as lucrative, even for the people who are the most successful. But that's kind of the point. It's this way for people who are interested in art and culture to escape the claws of hyper-capitalism reaching into everything that they do. And a lot of those same people are now really not happy about the whole crypto revolution, because here it is now, the industry has just figured out a way to come into that field that was this haven from speculation and financialized decision making and basically do the same thing all over again.
Right.
So it's a big sort of existential struggle, I think, happening at the base level in the arts right now.
Well, yeah, that's a very good point, and I think a good point to end on here. And I'll just end with a little bit of synthesis and opining, which is to say that I think that the NFTs have had success in the world of fine art, visual art, because that was already such a financialized space already. And in a way, I don't see it really taking off in the world of classical music because, as Tiffany said, like, how do you own a performance of something? We just don't have that sense of ownership of the object trading hands and trading up and making money off of your investment in the same way. People do donate to, and they donate millions of dollars to the classical music world, but that's more about social capital rather than actually about capital. And I would be very surprised if the Dallas Symphony gets their $50,000 bidding ask for their concert that they did with members of the New York Philharmonic. Well, anyway, Mom, sorry, don't think I'm going to be getting into the NFT market anytime soon. And finally, Tim, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and explaining this very challenging concept to us. I think you did a fantastic job, and I know that our listeners appreciate it. So thanks again.
Thanks for having me, Will.
And with that, on to our second topic, Tiffany.
Okay, folks, it's time for another classical Gabfest album review. From the Erato label comes an album entitled Amazone, released on June 26th of 2021 by darling of William White and therefore darling of the podcast, Léa Desandre. The original concept of the album, as you might discern from its title, is based on music of the Baroque period written specifically on the subject of the Amazons, the mythical race of female warriors. Amazone has been recorded with the magnificent ensemble Jupiter and conductor Thomas Dunford. Léa Desandre explores the fascinating ways that composers treat their Amazonian characters, particularly interesting figures in that they embody a male/female duality. Amazone has 3 special guests, real stars in the world of Baroque music. Cecilia Bartoli and Véronique Jean appear in separate duets with Léa, and William Christie features on harpsichord in a piece by Couperin. Let's hear a clip.
Posso far che non prorompe in ridere se sono le donne trasformate in uomini e dalla punta non si sa prevedere. Non posso far che non prorompe in ridere.
All right, let's review, folks. What did we think of the album as a whole, or any particular favorite tracks you guys like to point out?
My goodness, William. You just really wanted us to just bathe in all of
Yeah, are we ever going to do an album review that's not like fancy Baroque music?
Bring an album to the table. I'll be happy to review it. I like albums like this. I think that they're fun to review because in a way they're more like a pop album, I mean, just because it's a bunch of short tracks, it's a bunch of different things. And, it's not like reviewing like a recording of a Mahler symphony, where you're just going to get into all the details of the interpretation of this and that and the other. There's so much creativity that goes into something like this. I mean, I'm sure that we're going to talk about like some of the sound effects and the percussion. And, with Baroque music, you've got all of this improvisation and these, one Baroque performance will sound much more different to another than, say, like an interpretation of a standard symphonic repertoire, for example. And plus, on this album, you get all these weirdo composers that I had never heard of. I mean, Francesco Provenzale, never heard of. Giuseppe De Botis doesn't even have a Wikipedia page.
Nope.
I mean, that's how obscure this person is. I learned about, who is this guy? François-André Donican-Philidor. Philidor, who apparently is more known because he invented a chess opening and a checkmate method in chess. He was wrote a chess treatise. So he's more known for that than writing music, but his music was really cool too. So, that's why and plus I just love Jupiter and Léa Desandre and Thomas Dunford and all of these sort of extended universe of French hipster Baroque players. So that's why I brought it to the table. but I really liked it. Did you guys like it?
I agree, Will, that I think I didn't really necessarily sit down and like really listen, but I just put it in the background. And because the tracks are so short, I was kind of like, oh, I like that one. And then I may have not paid attention to the next one after that. But like I was kind of in and out, and there's a whole vibe to this whole album, right? You can kind of just enjoy what is surrounding you with all of this. Can you tell us a little bit about what makes this Jupiter Ensemble and this group of people, French hipster Baroque cool people?
So it's built around this kind of central dyad of Thomas Dunford, who's a lutenist. You know, he plays the theorbo and the arch lute and the lute, and he plays the Baroque and Renaissance guitars. I mean, he's just like a master of pluck string instruments. And he also plays like, I mean, you can look at his YouTube and he's got like, he'll play like Beatles covers where he like, you know, overdubs himself on all of these different Baroque instruments, plus like a regular guitar, and like sings in 4 parts over himself. So he is the like romantic partner of Léa Desandres, this great soprano who has, I think, taken a little bit the early music world by storm. So they form they're like the central partnership at the core of the Jupiter Ensemble. Then you've got people like Jean Rondeau, who I think is the one who came to prominence before the rest of this group. He has these very famous videos of him playing harpsichord in these like very aesthetic, like abandoned French chateaus, and he does all of this like Rameau and even more obscure French harpsichord music. You know, he has this piece called Vertigo, which is very cool, that he has a very neat video of. And then they've now gotten into this other, there's some other collaborators like Théotime Langlois de Swart, who's a French violinist, Baroque violinist. And they're all also very connected to Bill Christie, who is the noted director of Les Arts Florissants. And so a lot of these people also play in Les Arts Florissants. They've become, you know, sort of stars in that realm too. But Jupiter is where it all comes together. And so I think that actually one of my very first recommendations on the mixtape was from their first album, which is just called Vivaldi. And there's a fair amount of Vivaldi on this album too. But, you know, it's funny, like the Vivaldi, because a lot of this music on this album is from earlier in the Baroque, the Vivaldi sounds like I feel like it sounds like Mozart or something, you know, like in the context of the rest of this music. I don't know. Tiffany, what do you think?
I also enjoyed discovering a couple of these names that I just had never heard of in a million years. Like I really enjoyed the de Bottis selections. And maybe the first one that I'll point out is there's a pair of them towards the end of the album that is apparently both from, you know, okay, so the the background of this album is based on arias generally, that are taken from pieces that deal with the Amazons as a woman. But let me tell you, it's so hard to do a Google search about anything related to Amazons right now. It's just impossible.
It's just impossible to find this album. Yeah.
Really? I mean, and, you know, okay, so we have a pair of de Bottis pieces towards the end that are from a work called Mitilene, Regina delle Amazzoni, and that's Mitilene, Queen of the Amazons, which there were a number of them. But I just could not find, I wish I knew what she was singing about, but this is one of the things that I find really well done on this album, is that there's a sense of freedom in doing these, and that's really down to her technique, actually, the way that she's able to find corners, because, you know, as energetic and kind of novel as the current landscape around early music is, I still feel like there's more room, and now that I've kind of been shown what that might sound like, for rhythmic freedom inside a lot of what Léa is singing. And I think that some of the best demonstrations of that I've heard are in these two.
Yeah, Tiffany, I think that's a really good point. I mean, that's another thing that attracts me to the world of early music is, and Kensho's talked about this too, I think he said this a few times, is that like, there's just so much energy in the early music ensemble because, we're talking about an ensemble of maybe 10 players and musicians. So, they can really dig in a way where everybody's giving their full energy in a way that you don't always get in an orchestra of 100 people, where the individual contribution of one person maybe doesn't stand out as much. The other thing that I like is that some people get very snobby about early music and, historically informed performance, because they think that this is the authentic thing, and we better only listen to it this way because that's the way that it was done. And it's like, these people have done the research. But no, historically informed. Informed is like doing a lot of work there. This is really a creative genre that has been basically invented since about the 1950s, where people have gone back, they've looked at the early resources, you can read a few lines of something in a treatise from, 1680 about how this music was performed. But we don't know, we can't listen to it. All we can do is extrapolate from that. And we all know how hard it is to write about music and how it sounds and is performed. And you take that and you interpret that and you make it creative. And now we're at 2 or 3 generations extrapolated from that early research. So people are building on top, not necessarily on the research itself or on the original sources. They're building on what other musicians have done.
The creative process has become iterative.
Yeah, exactly. So, I think that in the 1980s and 90s, the sort of, maybe that's getting to the second generation of early music informed performances and recordings. The vibe was very much it was much more about classical music for relaxation. We'll get into something about that in our next segment. But now the vibe is full throttled, and it's they're putting all of these crazy percussion into it. And they're doing a lot of music, I think, from the Mediterranean area, the very first track on this, the Provenzale, you got all of this added little percussion, none of which I don't think was notated, but they're just sort of inventing this. And that's something that I really like about the genre.
Well, and I think that's something that is, it's very easy to approach from a normal classical musician's point of view, have a sort of amateurish approach to early music by thinking, well, if we kind of play things energetically and quick and with really kind of precision, that's kind of the amateur's approach to, and frankly, it's my approach, right? If you put me in an early music ensemble, that's the, where I would start. And this album is maybe one of the first examples that I've heard of okay, well, there's quite a lot of room. I mean, she does these kind of glides in some places that is so not stereotypically, amateurishly Baroque in my mind. And in a way that I found very enlightening. I just really appreciated the creativity that was kind of evident in her actual execution. Now, of course, there's the creativity in the actual, we'll say, special effects that are added to this album, not to mention the album selections themselves. And so do either of you want to speak to that? I mean, there were a number of little touches in there during the course of this album.
To that note, which track was it? It's in the Pallavicino. There's this little wind chime that happens, right? And I was I literally turned around when I heard that. I was wait, is that just somebody outside? Was that really part of the track?
Yeah, there's kind of small little creativity touches in this album that give you an idea, because none of us know, frankly, it was impossible to find the text for any of these arias. I tried, I wanted to know what they were singing about, because Baroque music is incredibly illustrative, and you want to know, okay, yeah, there's a duo of violins. Oh, there must be some sort of duo happening. That is that clear. And it was just impossible to do. I couldn't, again, total Google failure. I can't find anything related to Amazon that is not about Amazon.com. But there were 2 or 3 examples of, we'll say, technologically added elements that I think were trying to be helpful in that way. Well, cool. Check it out. Fun album, really good listen, very engaging, and good for the modern day ADD listener, actually. Let's go on to our third topic of the day, Kensho.
A few weeks ago, the YouTube star classical music duo TWOSET released a video entitled, Can Classical and Pop Musicians See Eye to Eye? In the video, Brett and Eddie invite two of their pop music YouTuber friends to debate various comparisons of both pop and classical music. Let's hear a clip.
Pop music requires less practice or talent than classical music. Should we start this one? And then they can...
okay.
Yes, go for it. Classical boys.
Clearly, like, have you seen any of the great violin soloists? I'm not saying, like, pop doesn't need talent. I'm just saying classical music needs that amount of talent practice times 10. I'm just kidding. I'm done. Feel free to disagree, because I also acknowledge there's a lot about...
I will not disagree. I don't feel free. Sorry.
Yeah.
There's a lot about pop that I don't understand.
Yeah,
right?
that's
just
the same.
From my exposure, there's just nothing in pop music that is anywhere equal to playing a Paganini concerto.
Well, can I also add to that? I think it's more... It's in its
Well,
lowest
this
form.
opens up a larger discussion about what qualifies as classical music, but before we do that, let's assess how successful TWOSET is in advocating for classical music and comparing it to pop, let's say.
Oh boy. So, I mean, TWOSET is a true juggernaut now, right? In the realm of classical music social media. Like a true juggernaut. And they do so on pride of the fact that they are both these kind of, let me lean into some stereotypes here. They're kind of two nerdy Asian Aussie kids who have studied classical music from a young age and have kind of leaned into the whole practice culture and the nerdishness that surrounds, being an orc dork. I mean, they are all that, and yet they've managed to create a YouTube channel that essentially serves as almost an ambassador of classical music and the culture of making it to non-classical musicians, and kind of liberating, raison d'etre for classical musicians who have been, who knows, made to feel othered by mainstream popular culture, right? That is their thing. So I came into this video, which, most of their videos, they address silly topics, but occasionally they will lean into sort of what is the difference between classical music and pop music and things that are culturally relevant. They do a pretty good job of this in general. They're very funny. So I went into this video, I knew I was going to hear something a little bit more serious in their discussion, and I was really disappointed by their inability to really articulate, even half as well as the two pop musicians that they invite to do this discussion with them, what is compelling about classical music, or even what classical music actually is, which they never discuss. They never once lean into what is classical music. They seem to take it as a given, in fact, that classical music is just this kind of, we have orchestras and we have acoustic instruments and we are nerds. Those are the assumptions that form the bedrock of that. And I was really disappointed because there are a number of things that I think are essential to the definition of classical music, and yet we're in this age right now, and I don't know, maybe we're experiencing more of this in the United States than they are in Australia, who knows, where we are trying to kind of redefine what classical music actually is, but I do think that there are essential characteristics of the genre, and I don't think that they got into any of them. And on the other hand, the two pop musicians that they invited, who are two YouTube personalities named Rumi and Jonas, whom they link in the description of the video, who do an excellent job describing what they find compelling about pop music. And there are so many missed opportunities for them to make the connection to the classical analog of what the pop musicians are talking about that I think really demonstrate why more and more of the wider audience is veering towards pop music as they define it in this video. I was really disappointed, actually.
I'm glad to hear that your guys' experience corroborates with mine because, look,
Did you feel like a boomer when you were watching this one?
I felt very smart when I was watching this. Like sometimes in the course of my life, I think like, gosh, I guess I'm just not that smart. I was surrounded by all of these Tim Schneider people at the University of Chicago. And, but no, watching this, I thought, wow, even if I am kind of a dum-dum, I'm definitely not at the bottom of the barrel there. Because listening to these guys talk about classical music versus pop, like even the pop guys, they were a little bit more eloquent, but no, I didn't think too much of this. Although I will say, in fairness to them, Tiffany, when you're talking about like they don't define what classical music is, we're over a year into a classical music podcast. I don't think that we've ever defined what classical music is to us.
Yeah, so let's do it. I mean, so they style the conversation by asking 5 different questions, I think, of both pairs of artists. And there are questions like, I generally enjoy listening to classical music, true or false? You know, I generally enjoy listening to pop music, true or false? And I was wondering whether we could do a better job than TWOSET did, right? Like, what are the defining characteristics of what we called this the classical gabfest.
Right. And in a way, I have wanted to skirt this issue the whole time along and just basically make it a kind of axiomatic idea that whatever we talk about is in the realm of classical music.
That's such a tautology.
Yeah, of course it is. But, you know, I mean, like, but what other genre is forced to define itself in this way other than just defining itself by the art that is produced?
All art schools are trying to define themselves by describing themselves all the time. I mean, we've talked about, for example, like the Impressionist movement, like was Debussy Impressionist or not? Mm-hmm. And we have a retrospective angle on that debate that says, yeah, he's definitely Impressionist, even though he didn't call himself. But it was super important to him at the time to tell everybody he was not an Impressionist. It was super important.
Well, one thing that they get into right at the beginning is they say that, you know, classical music has 400 years of history, not even counting the Renaissance and the medieval music and the Gregorian chant that came before.
Right.
And it's a major complexifier in this whole realm of defining classical music. Yeah. Like, for example, we would just have this long discussion about the early music genre, which is, I think, a subgenre within classical music. Yep. And we've also talked about new music, contemporary music as a subgenre, and whether that, you know, qualifies as classical music. I mean, so it's just such a broad tent that makes it very hard to define. Like, what links, for example, the conceptual music of John Cage and, you know, Léa Desandres doing Philidor on this
I have an answer to this.
Okay, lay it on me.
And I think it's a bright line. Mm-hmm. And it came about last week when we were talking about Nigel Kennedy and Jimi Hendrix. He called Jimi Hendrix one of the greatest composers of the 20th century. Mm-hmm. Okay, laying aside whether you agree with the statement, I'm not sure I agree with the categorization of Jimi Hendrix as a composer. Mm-hmm. And this is central to my answer to this question, which is that in classical music, we have a very specific mode of production. Mm-hmm. We have a composer who puts notes down on a page, which generally speaking, somebody else plays. And multiple people can play it. Anyone who sings Beyoncé's Lemonade is always just going to be covering Beyoncé's Lemonade. But I'm being facetious mostly when I say that orchestras are big cover bands, but that's essential to the way we create this genre. It is because we have a composer, a performer. That is the bright line for me.
Okay, but so then let me get into an edge case then. What about composers of music for electronic media who come from the world of academic composition and might also write, you know, for something like a new music ensemble, but they also write electronic music in the exact same way that a pop producer would produce a track? How is the pop producer not a composer, and how is the composer not a pop producer?
Are they expecting other people to perform their works?
No, they're expecting that somebody's going to hit play at the new music electronic recital
and just play the track for people.
Sure.
Well, I don't know about, like, I haven't experienced the concert atmosphere of this, but I don't think that's composing, frankly.
Well, that's super interesting, because to me, I think of an electronic music producer as being a composer. Like, yeah, maybe they didn't write it in finale or, you know, on paper with note heads and stems and bars, but like, to me, it's a more direct method of composition because you're dealing with the sound property in itself. You're not mediating it through this extra level.
Yeah. Okay. So let me finesse this statement. I don't think that they're a classical composer. Mm-hmm. I think it is essential to the classical music genre that there is essentially an intermediary, that your music is reproducible by somebody else in a live performance context.
It also seems to be like, you know, we use instruments that were invented not in this century, let's say. Because the mode of performance also matters, right? Yeah. It's not just the recreation of what is being written or this idea that there's an intermediary, but yet the tools with which we perform tend to be classical. let's say. I don't know.
I think that's much harder to draw a
for
bright
sure.
line there, because part of the issue here is that we've stopped really inventing new instruments that are not electronic. Like we're no one's necessarily toying with new configurations of a string and wood.
Our friend
tell
violin
torture
torture porn, not going to be happy to hear that.
Are you going to be playing those?
The dishwasher violin seems very laden with potential there.
Yeah. So anyway, that was one of the things that I really hoped would get highlighted in this video. That simply was like, I was disappointed by the assumption that classical music is just, oh, it's violin and orchestra music.
When you have such a platform and you are really the leading kind of brand, let's say,
you're an ambassador for.
You're an ambassador. So are you advocating for classical music? And there was one section that just completely drove me up a wall, where the pop musicians were saying, oh, yeah, for classical musicians, it's all about playing everything perfectly. And for pop musicians, it's all about connecting to the audience, as long as, and they were basically like, oh, as long as you guys, as long as you play all the notes correctly, that's all that matters in classical music. And they had no reaction to that.
Yeah,
like if I were someone that cared about the place of classical music in the world, I mean, I would have really pushed back.
Yeah,
and I think that my question to them is really like, is it just because you are afraid of getting too intellectual? Because I don't think that they're dum-dums. I don't think that. I think that they're good at what they do, and there's certainly an intelligence that's required to put together these videos and stuff like that. And they've thought about the place of classical music, how it relates to popular culture or the attitudes of younger people that spend time on YouTube, right? So there is some intellectual process happening there. So then why are we not going down that road?
Well, I think that they haven't dug into philosophically why classical music is or is not different from other music. I think that they are presenting classical music culture as kind of this set of expectations, almost a monolith, actually, that should be cooler than it is. And that's their angle, is that like these are the little things that actually make it cool and interesting, and not so much trying to find points of commonality between it and pop music. Because in fact, the duality, which the pop musicians do point this out, the dichotomy of classical versus pop is a specious one, right? I mean, the pop musicians say at a couple points that classical music was the pop music of its day. So that really should have forced a kind of introspection about what actually classical music is. It really should have.
One thing that I was thinking about, they were talking about whether it's easy or hard to be a pop musician or a classical musician, whatever. And this was really interesting to me. I had never thought about how certain composers, like even just the rebirth of Florence Price works right now. This composer that was basically all but forgotten due to the times that she was living in, and now being rediscovered and being performed all over. And this, or someone that was discovered posthumously, or works being discovered posthumously. This doesn't really happen so much in the pop world. The only thing I could think of was like there's allegedly a bunch of Prince tracks that are like haven't been released after he passed away. But there's not this idea of looking back and rediscovering forgotten artists.
But I think that is also centrally related to the aspect of classical music that I outlined as a defining aspect, right? Which is that it's traditional for people who are not the composer to play works. Right. When we discover new Prince tracks, we're going to play the ones that we think that sound most like him, or the ones that he recorded in secret and that were not related, or not published. And we're not necessarily going to have a spate of Prince impersonators who are singing his songs. That's not what we're going to have. But we will have a resurgence of people performing, and quite a lot of people performing, covering, works. There were so many missed opportunities where the pop artists articulated things that they enjoyed about the pop field that I thought that TWOSET could have really jumped in and been like, but we have that too. And it could have really been an interesting point of connection. Let me just point out a couple of them, like this idea that there's a surface level and then a deeper level of appreciation. I was shocked to hear Jonas say this in relation with pop music. They were asking, why do you listen to pop music? Or why do you genuinely enjoy listening to pop music? And that was what he said. There's the surface level of enjoyment, and then there's a deeper kind of puzzle level where you can listen into something and hear how it comes together. I mean, that, if nothing else, describes classical music and how I would love for people to appreciate it, which contrasts directly with what both of them were saying, which is that classical music is so relaxing and blah, 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 which we know is a...
How do we not talk about this yet? Oh my God.
Like, how do you not... I mean, they did push back against it, TWOSET did, but this would have been the way in, which is like, yes, there is the relaxing aspect, but if you listen at all closely, if you listen even 3 times, 4 times, and one of them, Rumi, does actually say, I like things that I have to listen to 15, 20 times to get it. It's like, you should love classical music. You should love it. You know, that was one of the huge missed opportunities. And then that kind of goes right into a different related statement that Rumi had made, which is that you can train yourself to like things. It doesn't have to be one of these knee-jerk, and like I appreciated that they had brought in these 2 particular pop artists who had this kind of under the cover insight into classical music, because the thing that you can train yourself to like, I mean, they were talking about something that very closely resembled minimalism when they got into discussing rap and the repetitiveness of the chord progressions. It's like, we did that. We have that. We have it, you know? And then, of course, this talking about, this need to connect with people. And that's what really is what pop music is about. And like, we have that. We are that, you know? We have much more in common than any of these guys think or dug into. And I was just disappointed.
Well, all I can say about this is people should listen to the Classical Gab Fest. You want to hear the good stuff? Come over to our podcast. I mean, look, I won't reveal our numbers, but we ain't got 3.1 million subscribers on our YouTube channel. So people, tell your friends.
Hey, I think if we keep calling out TWOSET, we might get more traction.
I will say, I am not willing to go on record trying to play like Mendelssohn Violin Concerto with the violin and bow reversed. I'm good.
Well, this is actually, we actually got somewhere with the discussion, and I hope that listeners, if you have thoughts about what we just talked about too, please write in and let us know. Alrighty, that does it for our topics for the week. Let's go to the classical mixtape, Will.
In our classical mixtape, we each recommend some music that's caught our ear this week to share with our listeners. So, Tiffany, what do you have this week?
I am recommending Georges Bizet's Symphony in C. This is a kind of a youth orchestra warhorse, we'll say, but I just love it. I love this symphony so much. It just makes me super, super happy. I think it's like a really good, exciting, motivated piece that I think every movement is awesome. I like all of them. But I think here I'm going to recommend the second movement, because this is just about one of the longest phrases I can think of.
The oboe?
Yeah, well, frankly, the oboe takes the first half of the phrase, and then the violins continue it. And when the violins finish the phrase, that's the end of the exposition. It's one phrase, the whole thing. And I'm recommending this performance by the Netherlands Chamber Orchestra, which is done unconducted, because this movement is so awkward to conduct. I mean, as amazing and long as that phrase is, I don't want to conduct it because it's a weird compound meter thing, and it's slow enough that you feel like you can't participate in it, but the music itself is magical. I think it's just like one of the best long phrases I can think of. So I was listening to it this week and just reminded of how much I really love this symphony.
Yeah, great choice here. Also, sort of ties into some things that we were talking about. You know, Kensho was saying like the rediscovery of pieces that were lost. And this is a piece that was lost for, I don't know, something like close to 100 years. I think
As a lot of Bizet was, I think. I mean, like he had a very short kind of like unreasonably obscured life.
Yeah, so excellent choice. This is a great symphony. I totally agree. Kensho, what do you have this week?
Well, in line with maybe topic 2 and 3 this week, this may be the first instance of electronics being used in a classical music work, actually. Ottorino Respighi's Pines of Rome, in the third movement, there is this gorgeous clarinet solo that people know, but actually in accompaniment with that is a recording of nightingales chirping away, which in the original performance or in the premiere, those sounds were played by a gramophone. And yeah, and I guess we consider that classical music, even though there's electronics involved. So, but yeah, those two topics made me think of this moment in Respighi's Pines of Rome. This performance is by the NBC Symphony with Arturo Toscanini in 1952.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kensho. A wonderful suggestion. For my suggestion this week, I am recommending a piece by Amy Beach called Bal Masqué, a masked ball. And I mentioned last week that I have a concert coming up. It is actually this coming Saturday. If you're listening to this the day that it comes out, I would be terribly remiss if I didn't mention that tickets are still on sale, including live stream tickets. So classical GabFest listeners all around the world, grab those tickets up. You can watch it from the comfort of your own home. But this piece is a 100% authentic style Viennese waltz. It would make you think that you were listening to Johann Strauss Jr. And, you know, Amy Beach is an American composer. We mainly know of her for writing the Gaelic Symphony. But this piece I have just had so much fun with. I find that it is exquisitely orchestrated because the first time we played it through, it all just sort of came to life. It also puts me a little bit in mind of the music of Edmond Dédé. I would love to do an all Dédé and Beach concert. Nobody would come to it, but I would just be delighted more than I ever have been. So here's Bal Masqué. Find the links to all these and to our full classical mixtape playlist in the show notes.
And with that, it's time to wrap up this episode of the Classical Gabfest. I'm Tiffany Liu, and on behalf of Kensho Watanabe and William White, I'd like to thank you so much for listening and to encourage you to subscribe and rate us on your podcast app. We'd also love your help spreading the word about the show on social media, where you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can reach us at classicalgabfest@gmail.com, and we'd love to hear from you. Until next time, happy listening, and we'll be with you next week.